Now. Okay, so welcome everyone. We've got it's just past 6 o'clock. We've got 59 people, 60 people who've just who are with us now. I suspect you'll hear a few more pings as more people arrive, but that was sort of approximately how many we had last week. So hopefully everyone who's going to be here is here already. It gives me great pleasure to, I think we're just going to get straight into the session now. So we've got 3 speakers today. Andrew Sayre is going to be speaking first, followed by Priscilla, who you've all met, Priscilla Alderson, and then Abdullahi Haji Abdi, who will be talking about engaging the Somali diaspora community in London with sustainability. But first, so I think we'll go straight to Andrew. Andrew, many of you who've been working in critical realism and even in other areas will know Andrew's work from the 80s and 90s with working with radical political economic theory. He then started in the late 90s to take culture more seriously, looking at moral economy and political economies and how they interact. And then probably the book that most people know Andrew for is Why Things Matter to People, Social Science, Values and Ethical Life. And I've spoken to a lot of people who have struggled with critical realism and have said that that was the one book that enabled them to sort of get their head into it and understand what it was all about. And then subsequently wrote Why We Can't Afford to Be Rich in 2014. So I think we can all see many reasons why that's become ever more important. And also on a personal note, in developing a critical realist approach to critical discourse analysis, the work that Andrew did quite a few years ago now with Norman Fairclough to develop a critical realist approach to CDA has been invaluable for me. So today, without further ado, he's going to be talking about how to do social science and stop worrying about values. So if I can, I'm just going to have to change over to his PowerPoint, and in fact, this should hopefully work. And so over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Priscilla, and good evening, everyone. And I haven't participated in this group before, I don't think, so I'm be interested to see what your reactions and questions are. Anyway, I've been asked to talk about critical realism, social science, and values, and I guess I am a critical realist, but I wouldn't like to be restricted to that. And so what I'm going to say about values, it fits with critical realism, but it also draws upon other philosophy, particularly neo-Aristotelian philosophy and the ethic of care literature. And it emphasizes the connection of values and normativity to matters of well-being and flourishing. And so if you're thinking about how to go from power over to power to empowering people and so on, I would say, well, what those mean depends upon what we consider to be good, what we consider to be well-being, what we consider to be flourishing. So there's no ducking the issue of values and what they're about. And so the subject of values in social science is such an old chestnut, and it keeps coming round from generation to generation, and doesn't seem to progress very much as far as I can see. But very often it's assumed that if you're going to be making value judgments, then that is somehow at odds with doing social science, and I don't think it is. Well, one way of starting this is, next slide, please, is through an everyday example. Next, please. You go to the doctor and you have your blood pressure taken, and they give you those 2 numbers, one over the other, and let's assume you haven't read up on the subject. So you find yourself asking, yes, is that good or bad? Well, what if the doctor said to you, well, I can't tell you whether it's good or bad because that would be a value judgment and that would compromise my objectivity. And you say, well, what should I do? What ought I to do? And what if the doctor said to you, well, I can't tell you what you ought to do because you can't logically deduce an ought from an is? Well, you'd obviously be thinking about getting a new doctor or a real doctor as opposed to a fake one. But you might also start pondering whether value judgments, what is good and bad, are at odds with objectivity. And in some spheres of life, it's absolutely clear that they're not, as in that example. So moving on to the next slide, please. Now, it seems to me that the debate about values and social science has been stuck in a rut for decades. And I would characterize this position where it's got stuck as a positivist radical standoff. So next bullet point, please. On the one hand, you got those, and okay, they don't neatly correspond to positivists, but often it's called that. Those people who want to say that social science should strive to exclude values in order to achieve objectivity. And they may not say it's possible to do it wholly, but the more you can exclude them, they seem to think, the more objective your research will be. And the classic response to that, which I call the radical response, and the next point, please, is that it's when people say, and I've heard this so many times, I still hear it, well, I can't pretend to be objective because I've got values and my research is unavoidably value laden. And I guess they think when they say that, well, this applies to everyone. So you can't dismiss my work because I'm saying it's not objective. Well, your work probably will be rejected by those who don't like it, reluctant to agree anyway, if you're going to say that it's not objective. And although they seem like polar opposites, they're absolutely in agreement about a crucial thing. And that is that values and objectivity don't mix. I think there's another bullet point there. No, but leave that, that's okay. And so what they're doing here is sliding unnoticed between different meanings of objective. And these are so often confused. And the first meaning is where objective is a synonym for value free, and conversely subjective becomes a synonym for value laden. But then there's another meaning which they also slide onto, where objective is a synonym for true, or at least an adequate representation of the world. So this second meaning is about statements and their relation to the world. I say that's an objective statement. An objective statement, I mean, it's beyond reasonable doubt. It seems to be beyond reasonable doubt. It's true. Okay, and then thirdly, less important in this context, where we say something is objective as in the sense that it pertains to objects as opposed to subjects, like human subjects. So when somebody is thinking about something or emoting in a certain way, that's subjective. From the outside, we don't know what they're doing, and we might maybe what they're thinking, we may be able to guess. And usually we accept their description of what they're going through, what they're thinking. We say, oh yeah, objectively that's the case in the second sense. But there's this third sense where objective simply means pertaining to objects, as in the objective forces of nature are changing the climate and so on. All right, those three meanings are so often confused. And just to show how often, well, to show how the first and the second are quite different. The next slide, please, which is an old example, it's not original, been used by many people. I think Bashkar used it actually as well. These three descriptions of what happened in the Holocaust. Died, millions were killed, millions were systematically murdered. And which, I want to ask you, which is A, the most value laden, and B, the most objective in the sense of approximating the truth? And I would say you have to agree that the third is both most strongly evaluative, clearly murder was as something bad. It's also systematic, not just random murders, but systematic, planned. And that is a more accurate and objective, in the sense of true description, than millions died. They may have died accidentally, or they may be killed accidentally, or just picked off randomly rather than systematically. So that's an example where sometimes more value-laden concepts are more objective than less value-laden ones. Okay, to move on to the next slide, please. Now, one of the critical realists who is best on values, I think, is or was the late Andrew Collier, and especially on moral values. And he emphasizes how values are about something. And our descriptions of the social world are always, as he said, already value-y. So we may describe someone as thoughtful. That implies that they tend to be kind, for example, or they're sensitive, they're attentive to the other person, and so on. But often we think about values in terms of, next bullet point, please, thin ethical concepts. This is wrong, this is right, this is good, this is bad. And inevitably, those thin ethical concepts seem somewhat arbitrary. Why should I agree that that is wrong? There's haven't been given a reason. Is this just an assertion? Is somebody just banging the table here? But although we summarize ideas about values, often using those terms, thick ethical descriptions, the next bullet point, please. Both good and bad ones, like kind and brave and so on, cruel or abusive, racist, sexist, and so on. They're different in that they imply some kind of description of what someone is like, or what's going on here. This is abusive. And we can kind of imagine what that might involve and check out whether we agree that that adjective is appropriate. So it doesn't seem so arbitrary. And what is very striking about these thick ethical concepts is that you can't split the evaluative bit off from the descriptive bit. They're completely fused. So if you don't know that abuse or racism is bad, you don't know what it is. If you don't know that suffering is bad, you don't know what it is. And next bullet point, please. So, for example, when a social worker says this child has been abused, what they're doing is making a claim which is simultaneously an empirical one about what is supposed to be the case, a factual claim, in other words, and an evaluative judgment that something bad is happening here. And of course, like any factual claim, it's fallible, it could be wrong. And non-evaluative descriptions of claims about facts are fallible too. So there's nothing special about the fallibility, the possibility that this kind of thick ethical description could be false. Well, yeah, sure it could, but it could also be true or objective in the sense of an adequate description of what is going on. And similarly, I could say, I could make a claim like millions of people are suffering in Yemen and Afghanistan. And that's, again, simultaneously an evaluation. If you don't know what that suffering is bad, you don't know what it is. And it's an empirical claim. Okay, next, please. Now, what I've been talking about is some ideas from Why Things Matter, my book on ethics and values in social science. And in retrospect, I wish I'd clarified what I said about values by using this diagram that came later. And the whole book is about normativity, about judgments of value, of good and bad, and so on. But often normativity is presented as being about instructions. You ought to do this. Don't do that. Do this. And in imperatives or instructions, in other words. But prior to that come evaluations of what is going on, what is the case. And there's a kind of recursive relationship between specific evaluations of specific things, like the behavior of an individual or a social group, and our values, which are more abstract, less specific, and they're more deep-seated, if you like. They're harder to change. And particular evaluations of a group of people are influenced by the structures of value at the abstract level that we built up over time. We may approach this person's behavior in an open-minded way or in a generous way, in a favorable way. Oh yes, those kinds of people, they're okay, they're good. Or negatively. And we observe their behaviors, and our evaluations are influenced by our abstract values, but sometimes the behavior can be so different from what we expect. The situation may be so different from what we expect or have got used to, that we come to question our values, or there's some cognitive dissonance between the concrete evaluations and the abstract values. And so this process of abstraction and sedimentation, it can involve either confirmation of the values or some contradiction with the values. But in practice, because values are embrained, embodied in our brains, if you like, it takes a long time, a lot of repetition usually, to change our values. And I guess most of us have changed some of our values at some point in our lives. And we can usually say why. We're unlike to say, oh, well, they're just subjective and beyond reason. We give reasons. I was wrong about this. And as Andrew Collier says, we can best become more ethical by gaining a more adequate or true account of the world, the social world in particular, and I agree. So moving on, next slide, please. This goes beyond critical realism to discuss something which I think it definitely needs, which is to recognize that normativity, the evaluative quality of life, is grounded in our biology. It's not restricted to our biology. It goes beyond it into culture. But first, we have to understand its biological grounding. And I don't think Bhaskar talks about this. Correct me if I'm wrong. And as the philosopher Mary Midgley says, you cannot have a plant or animal without certain quite different things being good or bad for it. And as conscious beings, we have a kind of oversight, conscious oversight of what is happening to us. And we can see a lot of, in many cases, what is good or bad for us. What is good or bad good for us is what enables us to do the things that we expect to do as a member of a species or a social group or something. And this is a feature of biology, that all plants and all animals and all forms of life tend to strive towards or try to find conditions in which they can continue and flourish. But we also have other higher animals oversight of this. And when we're describing situations, if we aren't told whether something is harmful or beneficial, whether a certain form of power, for example, is harmful or beneficial, then that account is descriptively deficient. And I have in mind here, particularly post-structuralism after Foucault, where Foucault insisted on, although he talked at great length about power, of course, and interestingly, he refused to evaluate whether any form of power was good or bad. He said it could be constructive, it could be destructive, but he refused to say which on particular occasions. And Habermas criticized him for being crypto-normative. And when you read his accounts of power, they generally have an ominous flavor. Everything could be dangerous or bad, you know. And I would say that if we don't know whether a social group or an individual is flourishing or suffering, then we don't know enough about them. It's deficient as a description. Those other references, by the way, if the slides are going to be shown, back up this kind of argument. So next point, please. So values are eudaimonistic, to do with well-being. Why? Because we can suffer or flourish. That's because we are living beings. But what about cultural relativity? Well, one of the things about human beings is that our capacities, especially our neuroplasticity, is such that we can develop in a vast variety of different ways according to our culture and upbringing. So different cultures define or construe flourishing in different ways. But secondly, cultures offer different forms of well-being and ill-being. There's more than one form of well-being, more than one form of ill-being. So I think critical realists need to be pluralist objectivists, saying that well-being isn't just a matter of invention. It depends upon our capacities for flourishing or suffering as they develop differently in different cultures, but not just anything counts. And quite reasonably, I imagine a lot of people are thinking, well, hang on, how can we say what is good, what is beneficial, what is flourishing? And in many cases, that's very difficult. We're unsure. But beware the all or nothing fallacy, where we say, oh, because we can't know everything about well-being and flourishing, and partly because there may be forms of flourishing we haven't discovered yet, haven't created yet. Therefore, we know nothing about it. We can say nothing about it. That is nonsense. So that would imply that you overrule the social worker who says this child is being abused, or the person who claims that people are suffering in Afghanistan. You know. Suffering, well, suffering is just culturally defined. No, it isn't. Or rather, it's culturally defined or construed fallibly across different cultures. Some construals are better than others. Next slide, please. So we have these differently cultivated natures. So yes, can you go back, please? That's it. I guess you probably talked about emergence, the way that the world is stratified. The biological emerges from the chemical and the natural to the physical and so on. The powers of water depend upon its constitution as H2O, but its powers are irreducible to those of hydrogen and those of oxygen. They're emergent. And our cultivated natures, if you like, the way we get socialized and so on, are emergent. And our innate aversions get adjusted and changed. Innate need not mean fixed, by the way. So how we are brought up as children, educated and so on, socialized, affects what's good and bad for us, but never irrespective of our biological limits. So to say all this depends upon neuroplasticity, which is remarkable, is not to say we are blank sheets on which anything can be written. That is not the case. Some things objectively harm us. So, like child abuse, for example. And in the course of everyday life, subconsciously, we value everything. As the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio says, we have these somatic markers which mark any particular experience in certain ways, which includes some kind of evaluation of whether it's good or bad in some ways. And as Iris Murdoch said, in everyday life, we notice what's going on to a large extent. And even without thinking about it, we build up evaluations. So what do we think of a certain person we work with? We may never have consciously thought about that, but if somebody asks us, we usually have an answer because we notice whether they're friendly or unfriendly or shy or whatever. And also, what is very important about values is that of huge importance to our well-being is the well-being of our commitments, whether they be politics or arts or music, whatever, and our attachment to particular others. And these concerns, as Margaret Archer calls them collectively, they recruit our emotions. And so these things come to matter to us, not immediately, but over time, as we build up a commitment to a certain, say, cause, then that they matter to us because they recruit our emotions. It's a kind of downward causation. Next, please. Now, you're bound, if you ever look into social science and values, you're bound to come across the so-called naturalistic fallacy, the idea that you can't logically deduce ought from is. And this is so often put forward as a kind of knockdown argument, a killer argument. So, you know, from the factual statements about the world, we can't say what we ought to do. Well, it's a ridiculous framework. It omits the most important part of normativity, which is evaluation. And our inferences that we make aren't all based upon logical deduction. It's not the only form of inference. We wouldn't survive if we had to rely solely on that. And logic, as Bhaskar very importantly reminded us, it's about the relation between statements. But the force of the ought, what makes someone's hunger demand food, doesn't come from the logical relation between statements. It comes from the body, or somewhere else maybe. Okay, so lots of eminent philosophers, Bernard Williams, Martha Nussbaum, Charles Taylor, Hilary Putnam, Alistair MacIntyre, Philippa Foot, have rejected this argument about is and ought as largely irrelevant. Okay, so next slide, which I think is the conclusion. So don't let's confuse objectivity, at least objectivity in the sense of achieving true statements, finding true statements about the world, with value freedom. Sometimes the researcher's values may indeed hinder. If you have certain preconceptions which prejudice you against a certain group, then that's not going to help. It's going to hinder you. But there are cases where it does help. So feminist researchers have been helped by attaching importance and value to aspects of social life, particularly women's experience and women's practices, which previous social science ignored. And that enabled them to discover new things. So values aren't a problem necessarily unless they're dogmatically held, as Elizabeth Anderson said. And how she discusses the example of divorce, research on divorce, where much of the early research assumed that it was an overall uniform blanket bad thing, and came up with findings which weren't very illuminating. It was only when more open-minded research was done which recognized that there could be situations when divorce was definitely a good move, beneficial to people, that they found out more about it. So we are living beings who can suffer and flourish, and unless we distinguish as far as we can that to some degree, then our descriptions of the world are deficient. So it's actually necessary for objectivity in social science. So I'll stop there.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much, Andrew. You covered a huge amount of ground, but with incredible characteristic clarity, which anyone who's read your books will be familiar with. Just responding to a couple of things, there was a question from someone asking which books I just mentioned. And please chip in here, Andrew, but I would say probably, I mentioned at the beginning why things matter to people. Would you say that might be the most useful book for someone to start out with?
Yeah, that's the one which I get furthest on, dealing with values in ethical life, social science, and some of the stuff on biological normativity has come later. That book came out in 2011. So I have moved a few inches since then.
Brilliant, thank you very much. And just in reference to what you've just been talking about, I think for your reference to Priscilla's going to talk in a moment about different types of power. And I suspect that with PhD candidates here, from thinking back to my time when I started out my PhD, having, I think a lot of people here probably have read a lot of Foucault, and that's a great introduction to social sciences. But for me, when I encountered critical realism and realized there were ways of conceptualizing different types of power, suddenly it offered the possibility of having a similar level of analysis to that which we see from Foucault, but without necessarily having to be as dystopian as he comes across all the time. So I think that's a really helpful thing to be talking about. And then also, I think your point that you ended on as well, talking about avoiding dogma, is something that's not often spoken about in those terms within critical realism. But I think that's one of the things that critical realism gives you the tools to do, is to spot and try and avoid dogma, which I think is of vital importance. So thank you very much, Andrew. Do keep your questions coming in, and I'll try and keep up with them as other people are talking.
So
but I think,
can I just ask, I should stay online until I have to. Are there going to be more questions now? Is that it?
Well, I suppose if you've got to get off, then if anyone's got any specific questions for Andrew, please shout out now. Come off hold and shout out.
Yeah, because I had understood that we deal with the questions immediately.
Yeah, we'll do that now. So if anyone's got any other questions, look in the chat as well.
Otherwise, they can email me.
Hi, I had a specific question. Thanks for your presentation, Andrew. It's just, how, as a researcher, do you differentiate between the dogmatic values that you have yourself that could hinder your research and the values that can actually help empirical research?
Well, you have to ask yourself, and it may in some cases be quite shocking to ask you, well, what is bad about this? Is this bad, and why? But you do need to make some kinds of judgment. So empowering sounds good, doesn't it? But I would say not if you're empowering a psychopath who's heading a government or something like that, But there are questions to be asked about psychological conditions like psychopathy and so on as well. We should ask these questions. We tend not to do it because it sounds frankly unethical to ask these kinds of questions. Why is racism wrong? And there's a tendency to assume that the reader will agree with us. The audience will agree that it is wrong, but it is useful to think why specifically, what specific kinds of harm does it involve? And there are good answers to that, of course. But yeah, ask yourself difficult questions, and of course we ask each other, challenge each other in that kind of way. But it needs that, I guess, when it's a collective discussion, it needs to be a kind of safe place where people can try out ideas and without fear of getting shot down and dismissed as a terrible person. Yeah, we should try out, test our ideas, our values as much as possible.
Okay, thank you. So I'm a first year PhD student at Bristol University, and in terms of testing that out, maybe I would test it out with people who are also in my research group who may think in the same way as me.
Mhm.
So how would I test it out maybe with other people who could actually challenge it properly? Not, and I mean, not assuming everybody in the research group thinks the same way as me, but they may have similar experiences to me.
Yeah. I mean, when it comes to questions of what is good and bad about some practice, there's a difference between, well, you don't necessarily have to agree with the person you're studying. So if somebody says something is bad, it's very important to report that that's what they feel and try to understand why they feel that, regardless of whether you happen to agree with it. You may think, well, there are unacknowledged circumstances here which they're omitting. So you might be studying a very patriarchal society in which, say, all women are expected to be married and accept the authority of fathers and husbands and brothers and so on, and in-laws. And you have to report that and report how they feel about it, whether they accept it or resist it. But you don't necessarily have to agree that this is a form of well-being. If they say it's a form of well-being, if patriarchal domination is what they regard as good, you don't have to agree with that. But you do have to report what they think. And you need to, if you're going to disagree, you need to present arguments, obviously, which they can take or leave. They should have agential authority over how they should carry on. But it doesn't mean to say they have a kind of epistemic authority about human suffering, for example, or human possibilities. They may think that women are not capable of certain things, but it's not necessarily the case. Okay.
Thanks very much, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you.
Tough questions.
They're really good question. That's quite a tough one at the end there, I think. But I think there's a lot to think about, and hopefully, I mean, we're going to try and give as much time at the end of this for people to talk in breakout rooms. And I suppose maybe that's just something for us to consider is using this space to confront some of those hard-held beliefs and values and as Andrew said, try and test them out. So thank you very much, Andrew. I think we're going to move on because otherwise we'll run out of time for other speakers. But it's very kind of you to come and talk to us, and as I said, incredibly useful, and a huge amount of information there for us to ponder on. So thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you, Priscilla, for inviting me.
Thank you.
Thanks. So without further ado, we're going to move on to Priscilla. So I'll just share your PowerPoint, and then we'll get started if I can figure out which one it is. Bear with me one moment. So
I'll just explain that I'm going to run through a few basic critical realist concepts loosely connected with values. And this is sort of to fill out the course so that we cover quite a lot of the different ground. And my PowerPoints start with a list of the things I'm going to cover, which I'm going to skip over.
Sorry, Priscilla, I'll be with you in a moment.
Yeah.
It seems to have disappeared, so give me a moment.
Yeah. It was great to hear Andrew today because I think I asked him if he would come and talk when we did the course in London, and he wasn't able to, being at the other end of the country. And Zoom makes it all so possible and accessible, doesn't it? So it's sad not to be meeting in the same room, but there are great advantages. And later on, we're going to have other speakers from Britain and abroad, which is I'm really looking forward to.
Yeah. Just before you begin, Priscilla, I just wonder if, because I don't want us to run out of time for breakout rooms.
Yes.
So, and we've also got Abdullahi coming in after you.
Yes.
So do you want to save anything for next week, or just see how we get on with time?
Well, would you like to give me about 7 minutes and then say that 7 minutes, and we'll do the rest later?
Of course, yeah, I'll
Yes.
do that then. Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Would you like to go to slide 3? And also, everyone, these are, I think, fairly basic and understandable. Here we are. Truth. Does truth exist? Well, we were talking about the empirical, actual and real earlier. And I think that's such a useful framework to think about things like truth. Because at the empirical level, we can misunderstand and misrepresent truth and tell lies. So it seems truth might not exist. And at the actual level, we can break promises and mislead people, and businesses can crash and betray their customers and staff. And politicians don't always keep their manifesto, surprise, surprise. So again, in the actual active way, does truth exist? However, at the real level of gravity, of causal mechanisms, of infinite powers, truth is like an infinite unseen power. And we rely on it for everything. When you walk downstairs, you expect it to bear your weight, wood and stone, not be like treacle and you sink into the steps. When you turn on a tap, you expect water to come out, not acid. Now, if we didn't have all these countless truths around us all the time that we rely on and believe, our lives would be completely chaotic. So truth is like a compass point. We may never reach the ultimate truth, but we can measure how near or far away we are from it in what we hear and see. Next, please. Secondly, human rights can be done in the same way. At the empirical level, rights exist in different ways. Women's rights are respected in one country and less so in another. And we don't have rights to love or to health. You can't force parents to love a child they don't love. And you can't tell a child dying of cancer, don't worry, you have a right to health, because you can't will or enforce that health or love. And that's what rights are about. They're quasi-legal things. They're ideas that have been refined by philosophers and by lawyers. At the actual active level, everyone in the world has a right to nutritious food and clean water. And when they don't have that, people will say they haven't got a right to it. But at the real level, the important thing about rights are they are claims to right wrongs. And rights are most real when they seem absent. We don't think much about our right to clean water when we have it. But when it's missing, that's when we need the right, the claim to change things. And over thousands of years of struggle by oppressed people, rights have been dreamt of and fought for, like the story of Exodus in the Bible. And the UDHR in the last line, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, after the Nuremberg trials, said that recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. We could go on about rights a lot of time, but next please. In Andrew's book, he talks about explanatory critiques, a central action in critical realism. There are two very important things about it. One, we identify problems both as first false beliefs, but also as unmet needs, as suffering. So there is a logic part and a moral part. And secondly, we identify the source or the cause of those problems. Thirdly, we pass on to a negative judgment of the sources of illusion and oppression. And fourth, we favor actions that remove those dangerous sources. So again, values run right through this work of explanatory critique. Next, please. These three, I haven't used them much, but I'm thinking they're more important recently. And they are ontological realism, We know that things really exist. We can observe and use and see them. Second, epistemological relativism. We know that we can only partly understand these things, people, objects. But thirdly, judgmental rationality. We can critically assess and select facts and form conclusions and judgments. And in some ways, that's a bit like your PhD. You start by looking, collecting data about the things that really exist, testing and checking them. You then use your epistemological relativism to analyze them, assess them, compare them. But thirdly, in writing, especially the conclusion to your PhD, you may come to judgments, assessments, conclusions. We're going to hear in the next talk a PhD that's very much about that. And of course, in order to exercise those three stages, you may well preferably use mixed methods, large and small scale qualitative and quantitative data. Not that you collect all of it, but you look at literature reviews to fill out the background. And you'll also may well use positivist, interpretivist and critical realist kinds of research, all usefully informing one another. Next, please. Now, retroduction. First of all, you may know about deduction, where you have your hypothesis and you look down and check lots and lots of data to see if you can support your initial hypothesis. Next, you have induction. You collect lots of data and then you look up and you think, can I make a generalization, a hypothesis about them? You might then find that your hypothesis doesn't work too well. So you'll then think about abduction. Having collected all your data, you might reframe your ideas, suggest that causal mechanisms need to be checked, think alternatively. But then retroduction, the really, in a way, exciting part of research that critical realism so much supports, is making your inference from observations, but seeking the simplest, most likely explanation by trial and error. Like the apple fell and Newton eventually thought gravity is not a force inside the apple and all the other objects. It's a great infinite force of gravity that is causing all this falling. And these new discoveries or inventions or connections are made by a leap of imagination towards the unseen causal mechanisms like gravity or evolution. And in social research, we might find they come from a desire for justice and for flourishing to explain why people do things. Thank you. Next one, please.
I'm just going to say 7 minutes up, but should we just move on to one more slide? And then
one more, right, okay.
Thanks.
Next one, please, then.
Oh.
Thank you. Theory, practice, consistency, and being serious. These are two critical realism concepts very much. And the aim of theory, practice, consistency is to rely on the same practical and moral theories and common sense in research as in everyday life, and to avoid contradictions and inconsistencies. Now, that includes treating your participants as you would treat your colleagues or your family, not playing tricks on them, not deceiving them, not betraying confidences, these kinds of moral standards. We'll talk more about it later on in the course, but I'll stop now. And I'm so glad to welcome Abdullah, who has been a long-standing supporter of this course and has spoken to our group many times before. And it would be lovely to see you again, Abdullah.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. That was fantastic. Thanks so much. Do we have
yes.
Abdullah here?
Are you going to show your video, Abdullah?
Yeah, I'm trying to get. I'm here. Yeah.
Hi,
we can hear you.
Everything's.
I'll put your slides up in a moment, but I just wanted to say to people who sorry that we've rushed through Priscilla slightly there, and apologies to Priscilla, but Andrew had such useful stuff to say. But just on Priscilla ended up with talking about retroduction, which is an incredibly valuable concept. And if you want to read up on that, look up retroduction in Enlightened Common Sense. Has a very useful. I mean, it's only about half a page, but it gives you a good grounding in that. So
And,
Abdullahi, yes, sorry, go ahead.
And also, if I could just say, Lee Price is very good on that, and she's going to be coming to talk to us later on.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Priscilla.
Oh, hello.
Yeah, it's me.
Hello.
Hi, Abdullahi.
How are you doing?
Good, thanks. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah.
So Abdullahi is now going to be talking about, well, I'll let him introduce his own research. I'll bring up the his PowerPoint if I can find it.
Yeah.
And over to you.
Yeah, my name is Abdullah. I'm one of the, I attended this critical realism for the first time when I started my research in 2009. I think it was just while Roy was around and anyone. And it was very helpful. You learn a lot. Although I had this idea, engaging the Somali diaspora community with sustainability, it's so massive, but unless you get some theoretical or philosophical thinking to base on your discussion and the research, it would be difficult. Next, please, yeah. Yeah, so my first idea was that maybe education for sustainability. I finished an MSc course in education for sustainability. And this idea came to me, maybe that we had so many Somali communities, so many new people, migrants coming to the UK from different parts of the world. Particularly, I'm looking for the Somalis. I thought maybe when you come back from someone who flee from their country running, they come to the UK where people always thinking about well-being, lifestyles, but they were worried about coming here and they have to think about and no more thinking about poverty or malnutrition concerns back home. It's more to catch up with the new life in here. So I asked myself, I said, okay, who can facilitate and the engagement of the Somali community with this? We had Somali community organizations which where they were helping the community to settle in the UK, but they were not properly trained. They'd never seen this, and they were trying their best to help the community. Furthermore, the Somalis, we speak only Somali language. We were not like other countries where they have the Anglophone, or we were Somalis. Everyone in Somalia speaks Somali. They were all in one group, one tribe. So by coming to the UK, they needed community support within the system. Luckily, I managed to get Beckerman and Kopler's research, investigation. They did this research around 15 different minority groups around the world. And they come up with different suggestions on each group. So the most important was what are the institutions that minority groups need to have in place to sustain themselves in their culture, in their education, their values. And this book is very useful. Now, when I had an idea, then I get Beckerman and Kopler's ideas, which supports my thinking. I needed research theory to use. That's where when I kept critical realism group discussions, I've already got this with me. Next, please. Yeah, this is now to do a research for sustainability, you need to have, first, when you're using critical realism, the main part will be under-labeling. You need to explore more about the background. And the core base of my study was to engage the Somali diaspora community with an issue of sustainability. There must be then an understanding of the impacts of migration history. You need to understand how that's the difficulties they went through. So my literature review went back all the way from colonization, what happened, how they come up, how they didn't end up in this situation. Coming all the way from East Africa to UK, it's not easy migration, this mobility. So then you need to understand what they went through. Then they need to be here, they need to train themselves, because the system in the UK allows you to get on with it. So you come in and you're given the freedom to help yourself and self-support. Unless you have a knowledge to understand what sustainability means, it will be difficult. So the obstacle in this situation was the language barrier. Their skills, experience, because they've been in back home, their life was always sustainable. Sustainability was the main issue. Although sometimes you might hear of droughts and flooding and violence, but the life back home is sustainable. They eat fresh meat all the time, fresh fruits, fish is fresh first thing in the morning. This is slaughtered and you eat it at lunchtime. It's everything so fresh, but I'm not talking about the points that raised all these problems. But then when we are in the UK, the community-based institutions that support them. But they are very limited opportunities for funding. Although they needed training as well. It was another obstacle. There must be a good working relationship between the community-based institutions, because the groups themselves, they come back home running and they divided in there, and they become divided in the UK as well. So there was not a good relationship, and this limited the funding opportunities. And they also need established relationship between the community-based institutions and local borough council. And here in this point, community groups, they were new people, they didn't have experienced community workers. So, and that also became another obstacle. There are a lot of other, the culture, the weather, the dressing, there's so many other values, the thinking that also they needed to adapt in the life in the UK. So my main target group were the community leaders, where sustainability comes. And we went through, like I used critical realism to set up the research methodology and methods and questioning, although when you are a researcher from Somali, doing a Somali research about, mostly it's not only finding out a problem, it's more into ways of helping the community to, the word flourish, we don't reach at that level, at least to sustain at certain point until they develop and get the right experience, well-educated, knowledgeable people who adapt to the life in the UK. So this is generally a very summary of my research. I didn't cover this. When you go to point A, you're talking about the history. You cover so many points and issues in that point. When you come to the formation of diaspora community, also it's a massive. So to limit your research to a certain point, like to make sure that community leaders are trained, willing to train. That's another issue that is very important, willing to reskill, to change their thinking. their values, and that helped a lot. That whenever we had the sessions, leading them, not to myself as a researcher, not as a trainer, but someone who at least explains and asks them the right questions using critical realism to enhance their thinking about being in the UK. And I hope this is, I'll stop here, and maybe in the future we'll have other sessions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Abdullah. That was really, really interesting. And I think as well, I mean, I suspect there might be other people present here who, like I spent over a decade as a teacher in London, so worked with many Somali students, and can recognise your reference to kind of Somali community groups trying to navigate their way through. So that was really, really interesting for me. Thank you very much. I think what we'll do now is, there was one person who just asked if they could not be put into a breakout room. So I'll try and avoid that, but if I do, just don't accept it, and then keep your camera off and keep yourself muted if you'd rather not be involved. So what we're going to what I'm going to do now is we're going to put you into breakout rooms, and unless Priscilla wants to chip in here. I think really because we've just focused on values, we were going to get on to power, which we'll now bring into next week, because I think that's going to be a vital thing to be talking about, the different types of power how we conceptualize power in critical realism. But if I put you into groups now, maybe if you could have a discussion about the values that are involved in your research. Are there any values that are inherent? Are there any, maybe a good starting point is, are there any values that you haven't questioned in your research as you approach your research? And let's use this try and use these rooms as a space to bring up those values, to maybe air the values that could be uncomfortable to question, and see this. I mean, I know this is sort of a ridiculous suggestion, but let's see it as a safe space where we do listen to each other's what we're saying, and we're able to talk through some of these values. So I'll put you into breakout rooms now. I think I'm going to also I'm going to stop recording, and then I'll put us into breakout rooms, and I will move through the breakout rooms just to check everyone's going okay. And Priscilla, would you like me to put you in a breakout room, or shall I move you around? You're there?